We're going to get underway with our next speaker, who unfortunately can't be with us today in person, but Jared has agreed to join us online. So look, if you make your way into the room, take your seats. I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Jared Mair, who's going to talk about navigating change within a disrupted global environment. Jared is the Chief Insights Officer at MPI. He leads MPI's Insights team, taking a systems view to track and analyse the impacts from geopolitics, trade, market shifts, new technologies, value chain enhancements, emerging business models, farming systems and inputs, and maps the implications back onto New Zealand's economy. I think it's probably fair to say that with all this global disruption, including fuel crisis through the Middle East, that Jared is probably pretty busy just at the moment trying to navigate his way through all of those things and analyse that for our benefit. Jared has over 20 years working with the food and fibre sector, holding senior roles in both the public service and private sector. So look, it's my absolute pleasure to welcome Jared to our screens, and Jared, handing over to you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and sorry I couldn't be with you there today. What I propose to do is sort of frame how we are sort of thinking about things at a geopolitical level at the moment, and then slowly step that down through some technology change, and then how we understand that change from a farming perspective, and also how we think about the inputs and the structures that are changing around our farming systems. So how we understand what's going on at the moment, obviously things are pretty fluid as they're changing almost on an hourly basis, let alone on a daily basis, but there are some clear trends that are emerging. And within that reference, obviously the countries that are closest to the war are the most heavily impacted. But progressively, as we move around the globe, we can see that there is increasing strain on not only what is happening in economies, but actually more broadly on the global economy now. And in fact, as the time goes on, we can now see that IMF is now saying that their short-term impact scenario is no longer valid. But while we're seeing these initial impacts that are impacting economies, we're now starting to see the second and third order impacts also starting to shape out. And so an example of those in the US at the moment, we can see that there is now a cap on withdrawals in the money market funds, ensuring that essentially that there can't be a run on the financial system globally. We know of at least one country in the Middle East that has approached the US around how they can actually do some more quantitative easing or print money to alleviate their financial concerns. And as we move sort of into we'll call the global South and Southeast Asia, we can now see some economies shutting down in the evenings, where they actually turn off electricity to mechanical services such as air conditioning and others in the evenings, through to actually now countries are only working 4 days a week as they sort of shut down, try and conserve energy. And we think about the countries that are most severely affected. Pakistan at the moment is the one that is most at risk, just in terms of supply of energy. But increasingly, the larger economies are increasingly getting impacted, where we can now see the flow of people from within India as they can't get access to cooking gas, and they're now starting to move from the cities back to villages. So we can see a layering of complexities and change now starting to flow through the global economy. And we'll expect this to continue for some time. So even if the Strait were to open tomorrow, we will expect that the impacts will flow on for some months. Not only is it the unwinding of the ships that are caught in the Strait, but it's actually the operation of some of those facilities is going to take some time to turn back on again. So we're looking at a sustained period of impact now. When we look at that impact and we understand how that's flowed over time, as you can see, the Red Sea, and that was the disruption from the Houthis, still actually hadn't corrected when this most recent event occurred. And that is primarily because of the trust or the security feeling of the shipping companies and also the insurance companies hadn't been restored. As we can see now, we've pretty much seen virtually all activity in the Strait of Hormuz cease. But obviously, as we sort of look forward to the coming months, what we're actually seeing is the market's taking a different view. So if we step back from that for a second and say, okay, so if we've got these big events happening, we can see the market's taking a slightly different view in terms of how they're pricing oil. What does that mean in terms of the broader global impact, and how do we understand that from a global food system perspective? Essentially, where we're at the moment is the US is currently in a severe debt. I was going to say debt spiral, but that's probably not a fair point at this point. But they're in a severe debt position. So they've just crossed 39 trillion in debt. The current interest payment on that debt is 1.27 trillion a year. And within that, if you think of them as a household, they earn about 5 trillion and they're spending close to 7, and they look like to be spending or wanting to spend close to 7.5 next year with their latest military expenditure. So we can see that that debt is going to continue to increase and compound over time. Conversely, if we flip and look at what's going on with China at the moment, they're actually printing money 4 times the speed of what they were doing during the COVID crisis. And the main reason for that, as many of you will be aware, is the financial constraint from their infrastructure and their building and construction industries being roughly about 33% of their economy, now being at a point of continued decline now for about 4 years, is actually meaning that they're having to put money into other parts of their economy to maintain their growth targets. And their growth is a target, it's not a reflection of what's going on in the market. And that is also correspondingly responding to their debt situation. So as you can see, their debt has significantly increased over the last couple of years, and again is likely to increase quite dramatically out to the end of this decade. So when we think about this from a global economy perspective, just those 2 countries roughly represent about 48% of global GDP. And when we think about what that means from a strain in the system, where you've got the 2 large economies essentially managing a debt increasing and increased burden on their systems, what we're now starting to see is the financial system is now starting to become more important, how we understand risk at a global level. So as you can see, the recent announcement earlier this year is that the actual monetary flows on a daily basis are now 70 times the physical flows of goods around the world. And there's an indication of 2 things. One, of the risk is people are moving money around to try and understand how they can keep it safe, but also how they can maximize the money to try and maintain some form of income in these uncertain times during heightened risk, to ensure that they can actually service that debt. And we expect that to be an ongoing cause or driver of both financial and economic growth over the next probably next 5 years or so, until we understand where this financial impact, plus also the obviously these wars and that trying to settle themselves down. As we move forward and think about where growth is going to come from and how we understand that growth, it's really important to understand what we think the next waves are as we move around the world. So as an indication, on the graph to the left here, as you can see, the US is the white line, and that is now in a rate of slowing growth or slowing decline. And then the reason for that is that there is a representation of the number of people that are in their economy and working. Correspondingly, you can see that the other Southeast Asian countries that have been the driver of growth in more recent time are going to continue to their decline as they move through that. And there's a representation of their populations changing in their structure. Looking forward, though, where we can understand where the next and emerging waves of growth are going to come from is actually in the other Southeast Asian countries. And that's, when we think about that, that's the emerging and developing countries, so the Vietnams, the Malaysias, the Indonesias, as they grow and become more stable as economies. And correspondingly, out over time, we're looking to the African countries to then start to pick up the growth pace and drive that going forward over the next, out to the end of the century. The key thing to note around this is 2 things. One is also their purchasing power and what they can do and how they can do that. What we're seeing at the moment, that the expectations are that for some countries, their purchasing power won't increase at a rapid enough rate to be a big bearing on growth. But conversely, other areas we'll see more increasing growth. And how we think about that are the countries that are growing quickly, industrializing, and also have a population that can't feed themselves. And we can see that in Southeast Asia, the GCC, obviously when this war concludes, and actually parts of North America, particularly based around Mexico. And so those are great opportunities for us how we think about growth going forward in those small, wealthier countries. Conversely, though, what we're also seeing is the aging of the population. And that aging of the population is going to have a big bearing on how we understand both opportunity, but also understand how we fit into those markets. South Korea is now the fastest aging country. So if you think about replacement rates of population, the replacement rate to stand still is 2.1. South Korea is running at 0.76. So what that roughly means is unless they can lift their population growth, they will be in serious population strife in probably 3 generations. And the generation is about 25 years. How we understand that, though, and we think about that from a population perspective, is 2 things, really. One is that we can now see that the baby boomer population, as they're coming through to their retirement and starting to age out of the economy, what we're seeing is that economies are starting to structurally shift. How we understand that is an example, and it's not my term, it's a term coined by The Economist, is peak death. Now, peak death for the UK is 2032, and what that means is roughly about half of all baby boomers will have passed away by that point. In the US, that's 2038. In China, that's 2036. Why is that important? Because what we're about to see is the largest wealth transfer in human history. Roughly between the order of $68 and $72 trillion is going to pass between generations. And that will have a big bearing on terms of what we consume, but also how the money markets flow and how we manage global liquidity. How we understand that and we shift down through and start to think of what's the impacts of that when we think of technology and the impact of technology on the global economy. An accelerationist is a person who believes that AI can compound on itself in its growth curve. So we know this is the case. We can currently see that in the most on the leading edge LLMs, which are the large language models, in the recent release of OpenAI's 5.3, we saw that 95% of the code for that AI system was actually written by AI itself. So as you can see, when you think about that, we're seeing that compounding impact. Now the key, so should also explain, sorry, just getting over a cold. I should also explain that when we look at this, we're not trying to predict what's happening in the future when we think about AI. What we're trying to do here is capture where are people trying to invest and what are they trying to achieve for those investments. So this is a representation of 4 of the largest VCs that are investing and working around MIT. So what we've got here when we think about this one, hopefully everyone can see on my screen, with this red circle here coming up the end of this year, when they talk about the grand math challenges, there's 40 to 50 grand math challenges. So these are elements within the field of mathematics where they have not been able to find a solution for. The current predictions are that they will have solved about 80% of those grand math challenges by the end of this year. The importance of that is quite significant because what that means is essentially not only do we have a greater understanding around mathematics, but how that translates to anything that is based on mathematics can then be solved. And so what that means is materials, compounds, proteins, genomics, chemistry, biology then become open for greater human, not only understanding, but eventually programming and development. So there's a big bearing on terms of what we can do, how we can do it, and how quickly we can move forward. As a result of that, the AI will then shift from how do we understand it from and what are its benefits in terms of human intelligence, and shift forward to thinking about what are the great challenges that we want to face as a human race and how do we want to solve them. Human longevity, disease, climate change, those big things. If you've been keeping up with AI recently, 2026 has been seen as the year of the AI agent. Next year is currently being predicted to be the year of recursive self-improvement. So if you think about LLMs as a fixed thing that's got weightings that are defined as percentages in terms of how it calculates and drives through and understands how, when you ask a question, how it's going to find an answer and deliver that answer back to you, recursive self-improvement essentially allows those weightings to become fluid and to be reset based on the memory of that LLM, which currently isn't available, and also within that what it learns in terms of bringing in additional information as it goes forward. the impact of that one change is expected to be about 100x in terms of computational power. So when people were thinking about LLMs and its capabilities and what they're doing today, we can see that this is going to increase and significantly accelerate over the next year or so. In conjunction with that, if you think that's how the application layer was working, we are currently, if you think of the hardware component, the chips at the moment are the Blackwell. They're currently they were 100x faster than the H100s. Next year, the key chip that will be out there is the Rubin. This is NVIDIA's chips. That will be a further 10x faster than the Blackwell. So as you can see, we're getting a confluence of both increase in the application level and also an increase in the capability in the software and hardware level. And when you compile that in terms of the size of the computational power that's being used, if we looked at last year, we had about 300 billion, 350 billion of AI infrastructure invested, particularly in the US. This year is expected to be somewhere closer to 800 billion. And next year, the thinking will be the first time it breaks $1 trillion at about $1.1 trillion per year. So as you can see, we're getting a scaling factor on top of all these other factors that are going to continue to progress and improve and accelerate and increase the capabilities. I won't go through all of these things, but I will just focus on the last two. So the flippening is not a light switch. The flippening is essentially a shift in momentum. So at the moment and all through history, the human hour of labor has been the main means of exchange. What they're predicting by 2029 is those that own the capital, those who own the IP, those who own the infrastructure, will then start to accrue a greater portion of the wealth from the economic system. So who owns it, who controls it, and who has the ability to shape it will have a bigger bearing on where value is captured as we move forward and we look out to the next decade or so. Similarly, out to 2030, this is kind of one of the more out there and more progressive predictions that they're investing for at the moment. But what we can see is that they are looking to try and bring to bear ASI. So ASI is artificial superintelligence. And that is essentially the means to understand things beyond human capability. And within that, that's where, if you think about all the sci-fi movies and everything else, that's when you get to the point where people are trying to say, well, can you have levitating cars? Can you have space flight and all that kind of crazy stuff? That's what they're sort of leading to when they talk about those in those sci-fi movies. Now, why is that believed to be possible? At the moment, what they've been able to do and are working on developing is neural networks over quantum computers. Now, in theory, that should not be possible. The scary bit about that is when we've talked about these big increases in computational power, that's under traditional computing structures and powers. When we think about what quantum computing can do, and I won't go through technically how it works, but essentially what we're looking for there is another step change in the ability to solve complex equations that would just be unable to scale under our traditional computing systems. There was a recent mathematic challenge that was given to the world's largest supercomputer. They went through and they calculated that the supercomputer would be able to answer that mathematical challenge in 10 to 17 zeros, so 10 septillion years. And they then gave it to a current quantum computer with 256 qubits, and it solved it in 5 minutes. So that's the difference in computational power. And then when you overlay that in terms of the advancements that we're seeing in quantum computing, the Mariana chip that was just invented by Microsoft last year is expected to be able to scale to 1 million qubits. So again, how we understand the rate of change, what that change is going to be able to deliver, and how we see that happening is all going to accelerate and continue to accelerate in the coming years. And while that might seem daunting, what we have now started to see are those grand math challenges actually being solved. A couple of recent examples, poor souls, but there were a group of 13 global mathematicians that were set at the task of solving one. They worked away for 18 months. They made some advancements, didn't quite make it in terms of solving the problem itself. They gave it to AI, and it solved it in 3 weeks. The most recent grand math challenge that was actually solved by not an academic or what you would describe as someone who is a a professional mathematician. It was actually a hobbyist mathematician who used AI to solve the math challenge themselves. It was a 23-year-old who just basically asked AI, how would you solve this problem? And then through a series of targeted questioning, actually solved the problem and released it, and it's just been recognized. So who's solving, how they're solving, and what that looks like, we can see that now starting to play out. Right, so how do we think about that and what does it mean? So I've picked these three. We track about 15 humanoid robotics companies around the world. The reason I picked these three is because they are all going to be going live and used this calendar year in scaling into 2027. Ironically, they're all being used in car manufacturing plants. The figured one is being used in BMW, Atlas is Kia and Hyundai, and Optimus 3 is obviously Tesla. How do we understand this and why it's important? So this is actually giving AI a physical form and allowing it to operate in an environment that's been designed for humans. So all of these are AI independent, so they operate without human instruction and can be now changing their own batteries. So they are fully independent and operate. How we understand this and why this is important. When we talked earlier about that change and shift in human population, people aging out, and global GDP is a function of the size of your employment base. Essentially what we've got here is infinite labor. How do we understand why it's important? So if you own the robot and you get to go to the beach, you get to win. If your boss owns the robot, well, then you're caught short. Conversely, if the person who creates the technology owns the robots, then they win and everyone else is a servant to that. And why is that important? How we understand that? Because Figured has come out and said, their CEO just it'll be 3 months ago now, came out and said, we don't buy and sell humans, so why would we buy and sell a robot? And so that's going to be a very important one to watch for in terms of the business model. Conversely, how do we think about the scale of this? So the Figure robot is expected to be able to be producing about 1 million a year by the end of the decade. The Atlas robot, they think they'll have about 30,000 being produced a year. The Atlas robot is actually a heavy industrial robot. So compared to the others, they lift about 20 to 25 kilograms. That one can lift up to about 50, 55 kilograms, and is quite a bit larger in terms of its structure and stature. Optimus 3, why is that important? It's the one that we can see, although Figure is going to go for about 1 million a year in terms of production. The target for Optimus robot is 10 million a year early next decade. And they aim to achieve that through about 1 million a year out of their California Gigafactory and the remainder out of their Texas Gigafactory. And again, when you think about how that plays out, this will have a monumental impact in terms of how we think about what we do, how we do it, and when we do it. From a New Zealand perspective, and we think about our food system structures, and what does it mean for our workforce, we are now projecting that we will see these robots in New Zealand working in our farming systems within the next 10 years. The only reason we would say we wouldn't see that is availability, and that is just the fact that demand might outstrip capacity. Where we would see that most applying is obviously milking cows, working in orchards, both pruning, picking, and and helping out with general tasks. How we see it fitting into a farming operation is not about replacing labor. It's about replacing tasks or taking over tasks, freeing up labor to do other things, and progressively taking on more complex tasks as they increase their capabilities. The one thing to note about these systems is that they're polymined. And what that effectively means is once you train one, all of them have that same level of learning. So if you're training 100 of them, you've got an exponential growth in terms of intelligence and capability. So this is something that we are watching quite closely in terms of how we understand our economy, but also farming systems. Right. Let's think about AI and its broader capabilities and what does it mean. I'll do these but quite quickly because I'm going to go through quite a lot. So Forager is the AI. The company is Brightseed. It's out of America. They currently have about 140,000 plants, and the aim is to have about 270,000 plants. Effectively, what they've got is an AI that tells you what the plant is, where it can grow, what's the economics, what its capabilities, what it can be processed into. Then they've compiled on top of that human health and or biomedical research. And they've created an AI that says, here is a human ailment. And as we move back down through that system, this is the plant and the economics to produce the solution or the cure or the treatment for that ailment. The first product that they produced was a gut health product, and in actual fact, it turned out to be from a waste stream, so a hemp seed husk. And what would have taken a decade took them a matter of months. So that when we think about AI again, the way that we think about this, we think of it in 3 ways. 1, how do you pick up some AI somewhere else and win through execution? 2, where is a gap that we could create it, create the IP, create the value, and export it to the world? Or 3, where are the black holes? And when we say black holes, the question is, how do we learn to live with it? Or how do we learn to work around it? And we term it as a black holes because it will be the thing that can accrue or capture greater value. We think that Forager is the first of those black holes that we can see in the system. Taste-wise is an interesting one. Effectively, if you think about how the global food system works, there are about 10 FMCG businesses that control about 80% of all SKUs on supermarket shelves globally. Within that, 8 of those FMCG businesses, they actually use Tastewise to predict and create their products sort of 3 to 6 months in advance. So what are they doing? They're monitoring human activity online, what people are ordering and buying, and what are they consuming in restaurants, and what are they talking about between friends. And what they're doing then is effectively tailoring their products to the consumers based on trends around what consumers are wanting and buying. Alias AI, essentially what that is they are now using a digital twin of the globe in terms of its weather and its environmental systems. Excuse me. And within that, what they're doing is they're overlaying that with a whole lot of geopolitical, and they're doing that with a whole lot of economics and the shifts around those things. And what they're now doing is actually predicting 12 months in advance on global commodities. And what was proven and continuing to be proven through the current crisis in Iran or with Iran is that this is actually becoming more accurate than what you would get from a standard analyst that we've seen in the past. So again, we're starting to shift to a point where AI is now starting to both understand and tell us where prices and things are going to be before humans have traditionally been able to do it. How we understand how AI and things are progressing through the biological systems. I'll go through 3 quite quickly here. So Pivot Bio is a company again out of the US. They predominantly look at cropping. They're on about 1.5 million certified acres in the US at the moment. That one product there has actually reduced the nitrogen leaching into the Gulf of Mexico by about 500,000 tons over the last 4 years. And what that product effectively is a bacteria that adheres to the root of a seed when it germinates, and it pulls down about 25% of that plant's nitrogen needs from the air. Azotic, that's a newer one. We picked that one up about mid last year. Again, a product out of the US, but it's actually now available in Australia. That's predominantly being used in the vegetables on about 2 million acres. And what that one is doing, it's actually bacteria that actually enters the plant itself in a symbiotic fashion, draws down about 50% of that plant's nitrogen needs from the air. Bonemia is a genetically modified bacteria. This is in the UK, and what they've done is quite interesting because they have not only gone for the nitrogen component, but they've actually tailored the bacteria to work with the soil that they have in the UK. And now what they've been able to achieve is both a production shift as well as an input shift. And that's quite a unique system that they've come to earlier. So again, interesting to just watch and see where companies are going and their capabilities are creating. Why is that particularly important and of interest to us? Because for the first time now coming out of the US is we are now seeing AI, obviously in the capabilities that it is developing, is now actually designing the proteins for CRISPR. So when we think about the ones that are genetically modified or genetically edited, what they're effectively doing, if you understand CRISPR, is these 2 proteins involved. The first one is to target, the second one is to cut. And what they're now doing is designing both of those proteins to the genomes as they map them for the changes that they want. And effectively what that means is not only can they make those changes faster, but they're more persistent and they're cleaner in terms of what they're doing because they're targeted directly for what that change they're trying to make. So again, as technology is evolving, we can see this starting to have, again, an acceleration of change, an acceleration of capability, an acceleration of how we think about it. In conjunction with that, just recently, the EU's changes around genetically edited organisms, we were expecting that to be back in their government, in their parliament this month for final vote. What that essentially means is that 2 months from when it is passed, that will be the new regulations, and that will enable or allow a greater use of genetically edited organisms of both plants and animals, or plants initially, animals to come, are in the EU. We had anticipated that this would have been passed last year, but there's a little thing called Ukraine that basically has delayed that. Moving forward, how we think about inputs into our system and how broader technology is starting to influence how we might think about what's possible, where is it possible. 3 types of water creation technology that we're watching. So Attico, that one we think is going to be on the market this year. That is from last year's chemistry Nobel Prize winner. And essentially what they've done is they've created a metallic structure that when you blow or move the air through that metallic structure, it can pull out the water particles and create water. The first product they're anticipating is a 20-foot container that can produce about 4,000 litres of drinkable water a day. Directly from the air. Why is that interesting? So if you could scale it up to a tonne, that would produce about 20,000 litres of drinkable water a day. Moving forward, the one in the middle there, the biodegradable biomass, that's actually out of the US University of Austin, Texas. They're an interesting bunch of researchers. We've actually spoken to them. That program came out of DARPA. That biomass is 100% biodegradable, lasts about 7 years. It is about $2 a kilogram to produce and will generate around 14 litres a day in normal humidity, which is, when you think about New Zealand, we're between 70 and 77% humidity, other than up the mountain. So we're in normal humidity range, but in an arid environment, about 30% humidity, it'll produce about 6 litres of drinkable water a day. Why was it produced? DARPA, the American military development programs, did that because they wanted their military bases to be independent of supply chain risks. So we think about that as a scale. Attico product would produce about, as I say, about 20,000 litres of drinkable water a day at a tonne scale. The biodegradable biomass is about 14,000 litres a day. So when we think about water and water creation and water technologies that are coming to the market and coming to market quite quickly, we can now say that we can actually put them anywhere we want them in the future. So if we want it on the top of a hill, if we need to use it for a sheep and beef sector, if we want to use it for a dairy sector, we can get certainty to help manage through the dry patches and provide water to animals. Conversely, when we think about land use and how we think about that land use change occurs, we need about 90% water certainty to go from an arable system or an agricultural system to a horticultural system. And again, these systems will enable us to do that at a farm level scale. When we think at a more regional level scale and the technologies that are enabling both change or the release or a reallocation of resources across our systems, we've got a couple here. So the first one in the top right corner, that's Anika. That's a system out of Canada. That's one that sits in the ocean, uses the wave action itself to actually pump the water through the system. So no external energy required. The big unit of that will produce around 50,000 litres of drinkable water a day. You put that in series, about 40 to 50 of those units, which are about just bigger than the size of a car sitting in the ocean. You would have it producing enough water for a large metropolitan city on a daily basis. So a city around the size of Miami, for example. So from a New Zealand perspective, that's potentially a really interesting tool. Has been tested in survived waves between 6 and 7 metres. So as our Resource Management Act allows things to be used in the sea, that becomes a more viable option. 2 metres away from that unit, there is no difference in salinity in the sea, so there's no environmental impact. The reason for that is it only desalinates 25% of the water. The other 75% just flushes it through. The other 2 systems, this one here, this is off the coast of California. This one's up in the North Sea. And essentially what they're doing is they're actually using the weight of the ocean itself to push the water through the membranes and create drinkable water. All of these systems are being piloted around the world today. So again, as we think about water both at a production level and also for a regional city and the interface between urban and rural water, or even recharging our natural water systems, we now have got technologies that are enabling us to have options as we look forward. And when we think about on-farm and on-farm capabilities, we now can see the first LLMs for agricultural systems now in application. This one here is predominantly for cropping in the US, but as you can imagine, what they're doing is they're collating and collecting tens, if not hundreds of thousands of decision points through those systems, and then creating the ability to make better decisions depending on different individual variables. We see this as a start, and we would anticipate that that will extend both across regions, systems, and operational models. So this is a tool that's coming to support farmers. A couple of tools to think about, or systems that have been created on a global scale. So this one here, I think this is quite an ugly electric tractor. But the thing that makes this interesting for us is not the tractor itself, but the fact that the company, FarmX, is actually looking to create a vertical stack. Again, coming back to our comments earlier around who owns and controls IP controls value, what they're trying to do here is link the tools, the decision-making, the data collection, the capabilities to inform and control decision processes across farming operations. So again, that's a system that we are keeping an eye on and just understanding what that's trying to do. This one here is the first multi-purpose AI-controlled electric tractor. So if you imagine in the past, we've had tools or capabilities that have been single use. This is a multi-use tool. So instead of having a hitch on the back of the tractor, this is actually the hitch sitting underneath the unit here. So that was one that was quite interesting that came up. And obviously, as technologies are changing, the spray drones and the delivery drones and the sensing capabilities that drones have is now becoming far more important in terms of how we understand where we use inputs, how we structure inputs, and within that, what capabilities we need from an insecticide or pest management perspective. And I'll come back to that in a sec. But the key thing here is what we're seeing is a linkage of decision-making tools and capabilities coming together to both optimize what we can produce and how we produce it, but also within that, starting to structure how we make decisions around maximizing value through the value chain. I've just put this in just given that we have had a broader conversation or implication within our economies around access to natural resources. These are just 3 examples sitting at scale. So obviously the Danish system is at an all of country. The CalFresh is one that we call a regional scale, and then one obviously for the home. What we're seeing now is the use of biomass now being used not just as a filler in terms of trying to round out energy systems, but now actually underpinning energy systems at a country level within the region and also within domestic settings. So the Denmark system's actually been in operation for about 8 years, and they're continuing to roll that out. And they have now got to the point where they are at the next stage of development, which is in the ocean, and they're creating a man-made island, and they're going to link up the energy system across Europe. The CalFresh, that's an Australian example. It's the first one we've seen in Australia, get approval for investment. When we step back and think about the capability of using, again, biomass or waste off farms or out of the pulp and paper, forestry sectors, is actually biomass is now starting to underpin how we think about not just energy for on-farm, but energy within the residential sector. So that one there obviously has a good scale. I think it's about 30,000 homes. In the UK, biodigesters are now responsible or delivering enough natural gas or methane for 2 million homes across the UK. And they think they can actually scale that to about 10 million homes over the next decade and a half. So what we're now starting to see is these technologies start to get adapted and adopted closer to home. So these are things that we can think about potentially as we move forward, with global energy systems being a little bit more disrupted perhaps. How we think about our nutrient systems and how we think about what technologies are available to create or offset broader capabilities. I've talked a little bit about biologics and how we're seeing that accelerate. We're also seeing the technology around what creates, in particular, focused on nitrogen here, but what we think about how systems deliver fertilizer into our economies is now going to be really, really important, how we think about that. I'll focus on one in particular, the TALIS system in the US. That one there in particular is interesting because what they're doing is, again, they're using solar energy with the taking and splitting the water to collect the hydrogen, and then they're pulling the CO2 and carbon out of the air, and they're creating nitrogen or ammonia-based fertilizers. I think about a $20 million plant is producing about 5 million tons a year. So you can see that at a localized level can actually be quite impactful. That one is currently got 3 in play, but they plan to have 300 across the Midwest in the next couple of years. So that is a technology that is scaling out quite rapidly in the US, and it's been done under a program called Landis. And so I think there's a big change coming to how we think about it. Now, that was predominantly driven by carbon and removal of carbon miles out of their system. But as obviously things have changed now, it's going to be far more around the nitrogen fertilizer and access to that. Some of the more interesting ones that are coming out in terms of recent technologies is this one, and there's also one called green lightning. And effectively what they're using plasma, or they are replicating or trying to replicate the impact of lightning in the air, which actually reduces or breaks the air atoms down, and with water you can actually extract nitrogen from air. And so we're seeing a lot of systems now trying to break down and create on-farm scale and also regional scale technologies to deliver actual nitrogen fertilizer to farms. So technology is going to be a big opportunity for us to how we think about what we want our systems to look like as we move forward. Again, let's look at what AI is doing from a molecular perspective.
Jared,
so some of you may, yep.
Just conscious of our time, because we are going well over time and your content is incredibly useful. Just wanting to have a bit of a check of how many slides you've got left to run through with us.
This is the last one.
Excellent. You finish and then we'll carry on.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. So just to finish up really, really quickly, AlphaFold 3 was essentially an AI platform that enabled us to design proteins. The isometric or isomorphic labs have developed a new one that enables them to actually design proteins for better use around health. But the important thing for us and how we think about what that means from an agricultural perspective is we're now starting to see proteins, or short string proteins, otherwise called peptides, now being designed to actually take out insects and nasties in our farming system. So while we've got a really good biosecurity system, over the years we have had a few things get in. Those things now, if you look at it from a 2020 value perspective, is about $9 billion a year, every year, in terms of impact on our GDP. For the first time, we're now starting to see the products coming to market that can actually impact parts of our system or be a benefit to our system. So this was one, it was got approval by the EPA in the US in September last year, and can then target varroa mites and leave all other insect species alone. We're also seeing it being moved into fungicides and other insecticides. So really exciting part of the system, one to watch. Again, a big benefit for New Zealand. We think this is going to accelerate, again, with the use of AI and the ability of AI to design CRISPR technologies. I won't do that one, and I'll finish there.
Wonderful.
Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Jared. Look,
sorry to go so quick.
Every time I hear Jared speak, it's fair to say I learned something new today. Peak death was one of them. I'm not sure what that means for all of us in the room, but look forward to exploring that and a few of the questions that are going to be coming through. There are many, Jared. Perhaps in the intervening time before you join us for the panel, you can perhaps think about how well equipped is New Zealand to deal with all of this change in an AI world and how it might link to trade, because there are a whole bunch of questions coming through. So thank you once again, Jared, for your time.